The sky over the enclave of the territory of Gaza has long been a dangerous place. For just about 6 months now, Israeli air power has been a hallmark of the nation's ongoing counterinsurgency against the militant terror organization Hamas. At times precise and at times indiscriminate, Israel's air war against Hamas has been the subject of intense scrutiny for months. But in the last week, Israel's airstrikes have increasingly gone past the scope of attacks against Hamas or even against Gaza itself, and in our lead story today, we're going to talk about 3 of them. First, a large-scale attack inside Syria against militants affiliated with the Lebanese Hamas-allied organization Hezbollah. Second, an airstrike on an Iranian consulate in Damascus. And third, an airstrike in Gaza, just hours old at the time of writing, that killed 7 humanitarian workers from around the world as they worked to deliver badly needed food on behalf of an organization called World Central Kitchen. The first of the 3 airstrikes took place in Syria's northern Aleppo province at approximately 1:45 a.m. local time. This particular airstrike was carried out against several targets, and while some sources report that the strike was carried out by Israel's unmanned drones, most reports concur that it was carried out by piloted aircraft. The attack struck missile depots used by the Hezbollah organization, as well as air defense forces not too far away. According to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, 7 Hezbollah fighters were killed in the airstrike, alongside at least 36 Syrian army soldiers and 1 Syrian member of another Iran-backed militia. Up to several dozen more people may have been injured. Said the observatory, quoting here, "It is worth noting that this is the highest death toll ever among regime forces in a single Israeli attack in Syrian territory." At the time of writing, Israel has still not acknowledged the strike in Aleppo province, as it seldom does when striking targets inside Syria. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, however, was quoted after the attack by the Times of Israel, saying that Israel was, quote, "turning from defending to pursuing Hezbollah." Said Gallant, "We will reach wherever the organization operates, in Beirut, Damascus, and in more distant places." The Syrian state news organization Sana has since claimed that civilians were killed and injured in the blast. According to one source who spoke to Reuters in the wake of the airstrike, one of the dead was a local field commander working for Hezbollah, one whose brother had also been killed in an Israeli airstrike just a few months ago. For the IDF, it was just another in a long campaign of air assaults against targets inside Syria, where members of the Syrian armed forces, militias operating on Syrian soil, and the Hezbollah organization are all likely to find themselves targeted by Israeli air power. As for the reasoning behind this particular airstrike, we can only speculate so long as the IDF remains silent on the incident. However, it's not difficult to deduce that destroying Hezbollah missiles and eliminating a Hezbollah field commander might have some utility for Israel, a country that exchanges rocket, missile, and gunfire with the Hezbollah organization along its northern border on a near-daily basis. Perhaps more important, though, are the implications of such a strike for Israel's broader campaign against international forces backed by the nation of Iran. The Hamas organization in Gaza, the Hezbollah organization in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and a wide range of Syrian and Iraqi militias all draw major military, logistical, and financial support from Iran in a network that those organizations themselves often refer to as the, quote, axis of resistance. This particular IDF airstrike, then, is particularly important for several reasons. First, it's a pretty major strike against combined axis of resistance targets, Hezbollah and the Syrian army, that claimed the lives of several dozen soldiers and militants. Second, it's a strike against the equipment and personnel of one axis member, Hezbollah's field commander and missiles, in another member's territory. And third, it's yet another escalation as Israel and Hezbollah continue to climb a sort of geopolitical ladder, engaging in bigger and bigger confrontations on the path toward outright war. Conducting such a major airstrike against a third nation, as well as Lebanese Hezbollah, with such a high death toll, brings the entire Israel-Hezbollah conflict closer to the sorts of attacks from which the only response is war. Can Hezbollah and Syria keep their response proportional when an IDF airstrike kills at least 44? Well, perhaps. But if Israel wants to escalate again, or if Hezbollah or Syria want to attempt to punish this attack, then the next strike in either direction has got to be bigger. And this can only get so much bigger before both sides hit the threshold that tips them into full-scale war. And with that backdrop firmly in mind, we move to our second IDF airstrike of this episode, a direct attack that demolished part of Iran's embassy in Syria on April 1st. This time, Israel struck the Mezer district of the Syrian capital city, Damascus, striking a consular building on the compound where Iran runs all of its embassy operations in the country. Inside that building was the residence of Iran's ambassador to Syria, but that does not appear to have been Israel's ultimate target. Instead, the airstrike was most likely meant to kill several elite commanders of Iran's special operations and unconventional warfare arm, the Quds Force. Killed in the airstrike were 7 officers of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, including Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, a senior commander within the Quds Force, and his deputy, Brigadier General Mohammad Hadi Haji Rahimi. Alongside the 7 Iranians killed were no fewer than 6 Syrian nationals and a Hezbollah member who was confirmed dead by an anonymous Hezbollah official in a conversation with the Associated Press. The strike was Israel's first ever to directly target Iran's embassy, a diplomatic compound that any and all geopolitical conventions would indicate should be immune from direct attacks of this type, no matter who is inside. Of course, that's not actually a hard and fast rule. After all, any international norm or Geneva Convention only matters so long as a nation chooses to care enough to respect it. But for Israel to attack an Iranian embassy in this fashion, while clearly aware of the potential for harm and destruction, it is an act that speaks volumes. Said Chatham House's Sanam Bakil to the Financial Times, quoting, "The strike is the most serious escalation with deliberate intent designed to put Iran on the defensive." Unlike the strike in Aleppo province, where the deaths of dozens of Assad regime soldiers could at least be masked as collateral damage in a strike designed to target the Hezbollah organization Israel actively fights against, there is no way to frame this particular attack as anything but a clear and direct assault on Iran. So, with both of these Israeli strikes now in the rearview, we're left to ask just why has Israel chosen this moment to engage in such serious escalation? And to answer that question, we're going to zoom out a little bit and account for some of the other unrest the Middle East has seen in the past week. Israel has launched several other strikes against smaller-scale targets, including against another Hezbollah field commander and against other targets in Lebanon and Syria. Hezbollah has kept up its ongoing rocket fire towards Israel, recently killing civilians, and Yemen's Houthi rebels have begun turning their attention from shipping targets in the Red Sea towards Israel instead, launching long-range missiles even as recently as Monday, the 1st of April. Now, Israel seems to either be losing patience or directly pursuing broader hostilities on its own terms. The strike against Quds Force leaders is especially telling, as this is a strike that Israel itself most likely sees as being against the heart of the axis of resistance. Killing senior Quds Force commanders is an act that almost certainly invites a retaliation. Just for an example, the January 2020 American strike that killed Quds Force leader Qasem Soleimani was seen at the time as a major victory inside the US, but has since set off a cascade of retaliation and escalation that many experts on the Iran-Israel conflict see as having led directly to the current war in Gaza. Israel may believe that a similar attack will test the resolve of Iran and of Hezbollah, calling their bluff to see whether their threats of a wider war are legitimate or whether the IRGC and its proxies are more bark than bite. Quoting analysts Jeremy Bowen and David Grissom writing for the BBC, the Israelis are looking at the fact that both Iran and Hezbollah have not been pushing as hard as some might expect. Now they will see if Iran and Hezbollah are going to push back. After this most recent attack, Iran's ambassador to Syria vowed direct retaliation, quoting, "at the same magnitude and harshness," while Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has vowed that Israel will be punished. International observers have confirmed that it's all but certain Iran will at least engage in a retaliation of some kind, be it by means of conventional warfare, cyber warfare, or something else entirely. The real question is whether that retaliation will be only a token effort, something designed to relieve pressure at home for Iran to retaliate without making the situation worse, or a larger and angrier military response. Many Middle Eastern nations condemned the attack in the aftermath, as did Russia, a nation that has long struggled to balance its relationship between Israel and Iran. After the attack, Israel's primary backer, the United States, has attempted to publicly emphasize to Iran that the US had no involvement or advanced warning of the Israeli strike against the Iranian embassy. That statement further highlights the degree to which that particular airstrike flies in the face of global efforts to avert a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran or a wider war across the Middle East. But as escalatory as these first 2 Israeli airstrikes certainly are, they at least have one small saving grace, to the extent that a person can find solace in any act of wartime destruction at all. That small saving grace? That at the bare minimum, they were carried out against military targets. The same, however, cannot be said for the final airstrike that we must address. The strike took place on the evening of Monday, the 1st of April, in an area of the Gaza Strip called Deir al-Balah. There, the convoy of 3 vehicles were leaving a warehouse where over 100 tons of badly needed humanitarian food aid had been unloaded. The armored trucks were clearly branded with the logos of World Central Kitchen, a frontline charity organization founded by celebrity chef Jose Andres. We've actually talked about World Central Kitchen quite recently on the Situation Room as one half of a successful operation to build a makeshift jetty off the waters of Gaza and begin delivering hundreds of tons of food aid by sea. As the World Central Kitchen convoy was en route to leave Deir al-Balah, en route to the city of Khan Yunis around midnight that night, it was struck by an Israeli airstrike. According to eyewitness accounts, the rear vehicle of the convoy was hit first. When the convoy stopped and attempted to rescue the people inside, the lead vehicle of the convoy was hit too. 7 humanitarian aid workers were killed, including individuals from Australia, Poland, the United Kingdom, Palestine, and 1 dual citizen of the United States and Canada. Photographs have since emerged showing the mangled bodies of the aid workers, some still wearing their World Central Kitchen t-shirts. Photos of the convoy show 2 of the armored trucks, quoting the Associated Press here, incinerated and mangled, indicating multiple hits, while one other could be seen with a large hole punched through its armored roof. Very quickly after the airstrike, Israel admitted that aid workers in Gaza had died. The IDF expressed sorrow for the attack shortly after it took place, although the IDF statement at the time fell short of actually claiming responsibility. When asked about the incident outside a hospital where he'd just gotten surgery to treat a hernia, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admitted, quote, "Unfortunately, in the last day, there was a tragic case of our forces unintentionally hitting innocent people in the Gaza Strip. It happens in war. We will investigate it right to the end. We are in contact with the governments, and we will do everything so that this thing does not happen again." The IDF has since confirmed its pledge to conduct a full investigation and emphasized its efforts to enable the delivery of humanitarian aid. However, World Central Kitchen has issued a statement that it had been coordinating the movements of this particular convoy with the IDF before it was hit, and that the convoy had been operating in an established de-conflicted zone and marked, as we said previously, with the World Central Kitchen logo that was intended to be clearly identifiable from the air. For the charity's part, World Central Kitchen has condemned the attack. Said the non-profit CEO Erin Gore, quote, "This is not only an attack against WCK, this is an attack on humanitarian organizations showing up in the most dire of situations where food is being used as a weapon of war. This is unforgivable." Founder Jose Andres on social media said, "I'm heartbroken and grieving for their families and friends and our whole WCK family. These are people, angels, I served alongside in Ukraine, Gaza, Turkey, Morocco, Bahamas, Indonesia. They are not faceless. They are not nameless." In the hours immediately following the attack, World Central Kitchen announced that it would suspend its delivery of food aid to Gaza on account of the organization's apparent inability to guarantee that its workers would be kept safe from the military factions participating in the Israel-Hamas war. Ships that had just arrived off the coast of Gaza using the World Central Kitchen's own makeshift jetty have since turned around to return to Cyprus with hundreds of tons of food aid still on board. Regardless of Israel's haste to own up to the incident, it's likely that this final airstrike will have wide-reaching ramifications and that the death toll of 7 that it inflicted directly may pale in comparison to the number of people who die as a result. As we speak, Gaza is in the process of tipping into a full-blown state of famine, and after months of warnings about the impending starvation crisis, it's been unsuccessful in motivating sufficient action around the world. Now, World Central Kitchen's suspension of its operations and the withdrawal of the few ships nearby that could have supplied food will make it even harder for ordinary Gazans to survive the coming weeks. And we should emphasize here that World Central Kitchen itself is absolutely not to blame for that situation. Quite frankly, it is unjustifiable for any non-profit to send its aid workers directly into the line of fire, even if their food aid is desperately needed. And now, even the direct apologies from the Netanyahu government are nowhere near enough to ensure that World Central Kitchen employees will be safe when a convoy that the organization took every precaution to protect got blown up anyway. Around the world, the strike is likely to have further-reaching ramifications as well. The aid workers who died in the attack are from some of Israel's most critical partner nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, and others. How these countries react, especially the United States, will be all the more important to watch, especially as the US is increasingly taking steps to hold the Israeli government at arm's length, instead of the protective bear hug Israel has been accustomed to for so long. Other aid organizations, too, now have to reevaluate their own situation and try to assess whether their own people can be kept safe or whether they're being sent into situations where they could be killed. The United States' effort to open a maritime corridor into Gaza may be interrupted or reevaluated, and the intense criticism Israel already faces for restricting the delivery of food aid and failing to ensure safe passage for truck convoys going into the hardest hit areas is only growing louder. Whether Israel, international aid organizations, and the nations of the world can come to some sort of resolution in the aftermath of this latest airstrike may have far-reaching consequences for Israel's war in Gaza, as well as a potential broader war in the Middle East, if Israel indeed intends to pursue such a thing. But however the aftermath of this strike shakes out, we're forced to recognize a grim reality that for many civilians across Gaza, any resolution will probably come too late. Hundreds of thousands of Gazans teeter on the edge of complete starvation as we speak, keeping up a desperate balancing act that they simply cannot continue for much longer. Even without the deaths of these aid workers, it was an open question whether these people could be kept alive long enough to establish more consistent humanitarian aid corridors, sending the higher volumes of food, water, and medicine that might be needed to nurse them back to health. Now, the likelihood of such an outcome has gotten far worse. And now we move on to our second story today about whether Russia could be behind Havana Syndrome. For years now, a foreign adversary has been conducting attacks on American citizens, including on US soil. Attacks that haven't killed anyone, but have left multiple members of America's intelligence communities disabled. Worse, the government knows about it, but is too scared to do anything. That, at least, is the dark version at the heart of a new investigative report released last Sunday. A joint effort between CBS's 60 Minutes, Germany's Der Spiegel, and the Russian opposition outlet Insider, the report digs into the mystery surrounding Havana Syndrome, the unexplained illness that has affected over 100 American and several Canadian officials around the globe. Their conclusion? That the incidents were part of a hybrid warfare operation against the United States, or as Insider put it, a year-long investigation has uncovered evidence suggesting that unexplained anomalous health incidents, also known as Havana Syndrome, may have their origin in the use of directed energy weapons wielded by members of Russia's GRU Unit 29155. To call the claims explosive is a little bit like saying the bomb dropped on Hiroshima made a bit of a bang. If true, it would mean Russia may have committed an act of war against the United States, one which left scores of American officials and their families struggling with long-term disabilities. An act of war which the administration would almost certainly have to respond to. The reason that you're not seeing this story all over the headlines is that some ambiguity remains. The key phrase in that last paragraph was, if true, and there are many who doubt the narrative sketched out by CBS and its partners. That includes the government, which responded to the report by telling 60 Minutes it was, quote, very unlikely a foreign adversary is responsible. So rather than dive into the consequences, we're instead going to use this section mostly to outline the new claims in the report plus the counterclaims against it. Now, before we get started on that, though, we do need a quick reminder of what exactly Havana Syndrome is. For medical professionals, Havana Syndrome is one of the biggest health mysteries of the past decade. A medical problem that seemingly first surfaced in the Cuban capital in 2016 and has since been observed across the globe. The symptoms are varied, ranging from headaches to tinnitus to blindness to projectile vomiting, but most cases start in the same sudden way. One moment, the person is fine, and the next they feel pain or pressure in their skull, often accompanied by what the BBC called an intense and painful sound in their ears. Of the 1,500 Americans who may have suffered the illness, the vast majority recovered, but over 100 were left with long-lasting problems ranging from evidence of mild brain injuries to cognitive disabilities so acute that they can no longer work. Although named after Havana, the syndrome has struck people all over the world. 2 years prior to the first reported cases in 2016, 4 Americans may have been sickened in Germany. Not long after, US citizens were stricken with the syndrome in China. But the full list indicates countries as varied as the UK, Poland, Switzerland, Australia, Colombia, and Taiwan, as well as incidents that took place in Florida, California, and Washington, D.C. Notably, the victims all tend to be people working in diplomacy, military contracting, or counterintelligence, or family members of people working in those sectors. Now, at this point, you might be asking something along the lines of, well, hold on a moment, Simon, didn't this all just get debunked as a weird example of mass hysteria? And the answer to that question is, well, yes, it absolutely did, just a few weeks ago, in fact. Back on March the 18th of this year, 2 studies by the National Institutes of Health were published that found no evidence of brain injury among those suffering from Havana Syndrome. US intelligence agencies have long briefed that the symptoms are likely caused by stress, environmental factors, or pre-existing conditions. One Canadian study in 2019 even linked the illness to accidental exposure to pesticides. However, we should point out that the studies released this spring are not the only game in town. In 2018 and 2019, University of Pennsylvania released 2 separate studies that suggested sufferers had possible brain injuries. In December 2020, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine put out a report identifying weaponized microwaves as the probable cause. In 2021, the Biden administration even signed a law allowing those suffering Havana Syndrome to claim 6-figure compensation. something they would have been unlikely to do if they believed it really was caused by stress. Hence, perhaps the long-nurtured belief that the real cause of Havana Syndrome was some new class of weapon, specifically one based on pulsed microwave energy or ultrasound. Here's how the insider explains it. Both microwave and ultrasound energy can damage cells in the brain as well as open the blood-brain barrier, causing proteins from the damaged cells to leak into the spinal fluid and then into the bloodstream. Advocates of the sonic weapon theory like to point to the onset of symptoms often being accompanied by pressure and noise. Here's how an affected FBI agent described it to CBS. Bam! Inside my right ear, it was like a dentist drilling on steroids. That feeling when it gets too close to your eardrum. It's like that, times 10. It was like a high-pitched, metallic drilling noise, and it knocked me forward. On the other side, though, people point out there's simply not enough evidence to blame a brand new superweapon, nor is it certain the science even checks out. Writing in 2021, Foreign Policy declared that, quote, "There's no evidence that a microwave weapon exists, and all the available science suggests that any such weapon would be wildly impractical." Later on in the same article, the writer makes this salient point: the evidence for microwave effects of the type categorized as Havana Syndrome is exceedingly weak. No proponent of the idea has outlined how the weapon would actually work. This, then, is the background to the joint CBS report from last Sunday. A background that includes dozens of people struggling with disability, wild claims and counterclaims, and a whole lot of mystery. It's a mystery the new report does little to clear up. However, rather than simply rehash the science side, the journalists tackle an interesting new angle. They set out to identify repeated instances of Russian spies who just happen to be in locations at the same time that Havana Syndrome starts striking people. The Russians, the report identifies, are members of Unit 29155, a highly secretive group within the country's GRU intelligence service that carries out acts of assassination, destabilization, and sabotage. You may have heard of some of their greatest hits. It was members of Unit 29155 that deployed the nerve agent Novichok in the English city of Salisbury, killing a British citizen. It was Unit 29155 that blew up the Czech arms depot in Vrabatice, killing 2. And it was Unit 29155 that tried to orchestrate a coup in Montenegro in 2016, just before the tiny country could join NATO. Now the joint report argues we can add another hit to that list: Havana Syndrome. According to the insider, operatives attached to Unit 29155 traveling undercover have been geolocated to places around the world just before or at the time of reported anomalous health incidents, or AHIs, as the US government formally refers to Havana Syndrome. The word geolocated is an important one there. Rather than estimating that the operatives may have been in a certain country at a certain time, the journalists have used stuff like mobile phone tracking information, the same sort of stuff that was recently used by police to arrest the Gilgo Beach serial killer suspect. They've also used eyewitness accounts. One victim in the Georgian capital of Tbilisi noticed a tall young blonde man lurking outside her residence after her symptoms began. The investigative journalist Christo Grozev identified him as Albert Avaranov, the son of the founder of Unit 29155. When shown a photo of Avaranov, the Tbilisi victim claimed he was the one who'd been outside her home. Other new evidence includes discovering that senior members of Unit 29155 received handsome rewards for, quote, successfully testing non-lethal acoustic weapons. But perhaps the meat of the report is the part where the investigators cross-reference all those who fell sick with Havana Syndrome and show that nearly all of them worked on matters relating to Russia. According to the report, many were subject matter specialists on Russia who'd been assigned roles aimed at countering Russian aggression following the annexation of Crimea. Others had what the report calls operational experience in countries Moscow had recently invaded, namely Ukraine and Georgia. Others had worked in Kyiv shortly after the Maidan Revolution of early 2014 that overthrew pro-Russian Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. The report documents 2 CIA officers and the wife of a 3rd officer who'd been active in post-revolution Kyiv, only to be struck down years later with Havana Syndrome. One was afflicted in Vietnam, another in Uzbekistan, and a third in a cafe in London, in what could potentially be revenge attacks on those Putin felt turned Ukraine against him. Talking to 60 Minutes, former Defense Intelligence Agency investigator into Havana Syndrome, Greg Edgreen, declared that the illness, quote, was happening to our top 5-10% performing officers across the Defense Intelligence Agency. Consistently, there was a Russian nexus. There was some angle where they had worked against Russia, focused on Russia, and done extremely well. He went on to emphasize that those affected were never mid or low-level performing officers, but only the very best, and then only those that were working on Russia. If you want the full details, we encourage you to go and watch the CBS report. We're obviously a bit time constrained here, so what you've just heard are only the headline findings. There's plenty more stuff that we just don't have time to go into. What we will say is that if Russia really is involved, then it would be carrying on a dubious Soviet tradition of trying to hurt American diplomats in high-tech ways. Famously, from 1953 to 1976, the Soviets bathed the US Embassy in Moscow with high-powered microwaves. But rather than with history, we want to end this section by glancing toward the future, specifically to what this report might mean. On the one hand, it may be nothing. US officials stressed to CBS that they continue to believe that Havana Syndrome is not the result of a foreign adversary. If that's the case, then this is just another example of reporters chasing shadows, so lost in their Cold War cosplay that they're willing to see Putin's blood-soaked hand behind almost anything. On the other hand, it could act as something of a warning. If it came out that Moscow had indeed used an experimental new weapon on US soil to harm US citizens and that the American government had lied about it, it would likely mean two things. One, Russia may have committed an act of war against the United States, and the Biden administration would have to figure out how to respond without getting into a shooting match with Moscow. And two, that Uncle Sam would have been made to look weak in the eyes of the world, preferring to cover up an attack on its own officials rather than stare down a dangerous opponent. Again, that is a pretty big if. Despite the in-depth reporting by CBS, The Insider, and Der Spiegel, we're still not comfortable saying that Havana Syndrome is caused by a weapon. Regardless of the truth, it seems like the story of the mysterious illness afflicting American diplomats is not yet over. Whether there are more twists to come is something that we're simply going to have to wait to find out. And next today we pivot to the skies over Ukraine, with the prospect of a long-awaited delivery of American-made advanced F-16 fighter jets finally on the verge of becoming reality. But unfortunately for Ukraine, the situation comes with far more asterisks than the architects of the F-16 plan had intended, leaving a range of open questions on whether these precious fighter jets will even arrive in time to make a difference. We'll start with what Ukraine and its Western backers would probably refer to as the good news, and in fairness to Ukraine, there's a decent amount of good news to report. Chief among the items on Ukraine's bulletin is the country's first clear public projections on when the first batch of F-16s will be ready to serve in a combat role. That ETA? Summer of 2024. At that time, Ukraine's first group of 12 pilots are expected to be combat ready to begin operations over Ukraine after completing extensive training under the watchful gaze of trainers from the US, the UK, and Denmark. When they arrive, they'll break onto a battlefield where Russian air support is making its own increasing headway, providing overwatch and conducting long-range glide bombing operations from the relative safety of eastern Ukraine. But unfortunately for the boys in blue and yellow, that's where the good news ends. And the problems begin as soon as you start asking the question, how many F-16s will Ukraine have? You'd think that the number would be at least 12, the same number as the cohort of pilots that are showing up on the front lines, which, by the way, is still a few pilots short of a single squadron. But alas, Ukraine is projected to have received as few as 6 F-16s by the time these pilots are ready to fulfill their combat duties. Just 6 warplanes, of advanced, but not extraordinary make, expected to face down legions of Russian combat aircraft and surface-to-air defenses. Those 6 will be the first of about 45 that have thus far been promised to Ukraine by Europe, not even a quarter of the 200 F-16s that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky requested in the early months of the war. And while Ukraine is quite understandably watching these promised F-16s like a hawk, well aware that the arrival of any NATO-supplied F-16s will still be an event that captures the world's attention, Russian President Vladimir Putin is keeping a close eye on the upcoming delivery, and so is the Russian Ministry of Defense. This past week, in an address by Russian Air Force pilots, Putin addressed the anticipated Ukrainian F-16s directly. Quoting now, "The idea that we will attack some other country, Poland, the Baltic states, and the Czechs are also being scared, is complete nonsense. It's just drivel." Continuing the quote, "If they supply F-16s, and they are talking about this, and are apparently training pilots, this will not change the situation on the battlefield, and we will destroy the aircraft, just as we destroy today tanks, armored vehicles, and other equipment, including multiple rocket launchers." But then Putin got to what he seemed to know would be the important part for Ukraine's allies and backers around the world. Quoting again, "Of course, if they will be used from airfields in third countries, they become, for us, legitimate targets, wherever they might be located." Now, whether that statement should be taken seriously or written off as yet more empty bluster from Putin, we'll let you decide. After all, that's not really our point, at least not today. Instead, we'd like to draw attention to just how focused both sides of the Ukraine conflict are toward the arrival of these aircraft, even despite the fact that there's just a small handful slated to show up in the early phases. But with that intensified focus comes a broader question. Can we, or Ukraine, reasonably expect this handful of planes to make any difference even when they do arrive? Or is the simple act of flying them into contested airspace all but guaranteed to see them shot down and made into propaganda victories for the Russian Ministry of Defense? When we discussed the news on the F-16 timeline, we started with Ukraine's good news and we moved to the bad, so this time we'll start with the negatives. As we've already covered in a past video on this channel, the F-16 is not an easy plane to operate. It requires pristine runways that can be easily cratered by Russian bombs or missiles, and it must be kept safe in reinforced hangars that are, at once, hard to come by and also hard to disguise unless they're being built underground. Maintaining the plane is also very difficult, and it requires 17 maintenance hours per flight hour, meaning that it's not the sort of aircraft where these 12 pilots could split up to a plane and run them ragged around the clock in 12-hour shifts. And while the exact number of combat-ready Russian fighter aircraft is tough to pin down, the nation still fields at least a few hundred relatively advanced fighter aircraft that, whether or not they can go toe-to-toe in a two-plane dogfight with an F-16, can certainly bring them down in a confrontation that's, let's say, 500 against a measly 6. Russia's surface-to-air missiles are similarly robust, and although the loss of critical airborne early warning and control aircraft have diminished Russia's situational awareness in the skies, the unstealthy F-16 still wouldn't want to run afoul of a Russian S-400 if it doesn't have to. Not only that, but the F-16 won't just be within range of Russian warfighting equipment when it enters combat service. It's likely to be hunted down and made into a top symbolic priority for the Russian MOD if it flies within Russian crosshairs. But not all is lost for the F-16 mission either, because while Ukraine will need to think creatively and be highly discerning about when and where their precious warplanes go, even this handful of aircraft can change the situation on the ground. And we've got to be clear here. We're talking about an impact on the scale of individual battlefields at best, barring any Luke Skywalker against the Death Star sort of flying. It's simply unlikely that the change made by a single F-16 will cascade into a new Ukrainian Thunder Run offensive on the ground or anything remotely comparable. But the long-range overwatch and missile strike capabilities that the F-16 brings will provide badly needed air cover for Ukrainian troops who could have benefited massively from such cover when trying to push forward last year in a largely unsuccessful counter-offensive. That air cover will be all the more important now as Ukraine finds itself on the defensive against what looks as if it'll be yet another grinding, miserable summer trying to slow down a Russian advance. Unfortunately, there's one final piece of bad news that we've got to relate about the F-16, that no matter whether deliveries of aircraft eventually pick up, these 12 soon-to-arrive pilots may be the only ones Ukraine can field in combat for a long while. The next cohort of 8 Ukrainian pilots is slated to arrive for training at a base in NATO-allied Romania no earlier than the end of summer 2024, and any pilots who might come and train after that cohort aren't even close to establishing a timeline for when they can show up. These pilots take a long time to train, even once they do arrive, and even though the US and other training nations have been able to compress the typical years that a pilot needs to learn to fly the F-16 into a span of several months, even the shortened timeline will feel like an eternity when compared to how long Ukrainian troops must hold out on the battlefield. The language barrier during the training is yet another problem, as it is a tactical barrier when trying to train pilots on Western tactics after they've been brought up on old Soviet-era doctrine. With so much hanging in the balance, Ukraine's first 12 F-16 pilots will be under immense pressure to turn the tide on the battlefield while simultaneously keeping themselves and their aircraft safe in the face of overwhelming odds. Whether or not they can do that probably won't be enough to win the war all by themselves. But it's these F-16 pilots who stand the best chance to either staunch Ukraine's bleeding on the battlefield or find themselves powerless to prevent it from getting worse. And finally, we turn our attention to South Sudan. It is the world's newest country, and arguably its most troubled. When South Sudan split from Sudan in 2011, the international mood could best be summed up as cautious optimism. Although rural and underdeveloped, the new state had enormous oil reserves and was backed by heavy hitters like the United States and Norway. Its capital, Juba, was fast turning into a boomtown. With just a little luck, it was felt South Sudan could become an African success story. Sadly, luck would turn out to be in short supply. after a political struggle erupted between President Salva Kiir, backed by the Dinka ethnic group, and Nuer group-backed Vice President Riek Machar in 2013, the new country plunged into a bitter civil war. Over the next 5 years, some 400,000 would perish in the violence, 4 million were displaced. Although a power-sharing agreement was reached in 2018, the damage had already been done. In the years since the war ended, intercommunal violence has continued to claim hundreds of lives annually. Any hopes of rapid development using oil money have evaporated. According to the UN, South Sudan remains the least developed country in the world. To top it all off, the 2023 outbreak of civil war in neighboring Sudan sent 500,000 refugees fleeing into overcrowded camps in South Sudan. Camps now stalked by violence and despair and hunger. This is what we mean when we say South Sudan is a troubled place. With an average life expectancy of just 55 compared to over 76 in America, it ranks low on most indicators of well-being. According to the charity Concern, a mere 10% of the country has access to sanitation. 70% lack access to basic healthcare. Al Jazeera claims over 2/3 of the population of 12 million suffered extreme hunger in 2023. Bloomberg notes that local currency has recently slumped against the dollar, while the price of staple goods has tripled. In short, this is a fragile nation, one precariously balanced between two warlords, riven by ethnic tensions, and with a dysfunctional economy that's only just about kept afloat by oil exports. All of which is why the recent news has been so troubling. Back in late March, multiple outlets reported that one of South Sudan's 2 major oil export pipelines had ruptured. Unable to fix it, the government is now facing a scenario where the economy ceases to even be dysfunctional or any kind of functional at all. And if that happens, experts are warning that we could see a resurgence of violence. The problem started back in February, although they weren't reported in any detail until last month. According to the Sudan War Monitor, the Petrodar pipeline running from Upper Nile State clogged after the pumping stations ran out of diesel. This caused a major rupture, leading to a large amount of heavy, sweet Dar blend grade oil spilling out into the desert. Energy industry outlet Argus claims the problems are currently stopping 100,000 barrels per day from reaching the Bashair terminal on the Red Sea for export. Of course, this in and of itself is not majorly unusual. Oil pipelines do occasionally rupture, and it's bad news for everyone involved until the engineers can get in there and fix it. But it's here where we come to the crux of the issue. Fixing the rupture is currently impossible. That's because the Petrodar pipeline doesn't run through South Sudan, it runs through Sudan. Specifically, it runs right through the middle of a frontline area in the country's sprawling civil war. Remember how we said South Sudan inherited huge oil reserves upon independence? Well, part of the agreement was that landlocked South Sudan would have to pump that oil across its old master Sudan to get it out to the global marketplace via the Red Sea. Juba would get its oil income, Khartoum would take its cut, and a Chinese-Malaysian consortium would take charge of shipping. Everyone was going to be a winner. Now, this dream was always based on some faulty logic. With the oil companies already taking a 60% cut, South Sudan was forced to use most of the remaining earnings to pay off debts, plus an indemnity it owed to Sudan as part of the independence agreement. What little actually went to the government in Juba was quickly siphoned off by President Salva Kiir to buy elite support. Still, it remains the nation's one economic lifeline. Bloomberg estimates over 90% of South Sudan's revenues come in the form of oil exports. While that also includes oil pumped through the still operational Greater Nile pipeline, which runs separately from Unity State, Al Jazeera writes that the ruptured pipeline alone, quote, accounts for 2/3 or 3/4 of oil revenues. Already, the recent Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping has been eating into these earnings. But with Petrodar pipeline now too dangerous to repair, production has dropped off a cliff. From 153,000 barrels a day in 2021, Argus estimates that South Sudan's output has now dropped to around 80,000 per day. For a poor country, that is a hell of a cut. As the head of the Parliamentary Subcommittee on Petroleum, Boutros Ghali, recently warned, with the loss of the majority of our national income, we face the grim prospect of a humanitarian disaster, political instability, and security unrest in our already fragile state. France 24 reports he went on to estimate losses could total $100 million per month and warned of fuel shortages, prolonged power outages, disruptions in transportation and other essential services if the pipeline wasn't fixed soon. South Sudan, you see, is so cash-strapped that Juba hasn't been able to pay the salaries of public sector workers for 6 months. Should President Salva Kiir now find himself unable to pay the military, there is a decent chance that things could tip over into violence. The good news is that this hopefully won't happen anytime soon. Finance Minister Awad Daniel Trung recently told reporters that an unnamed foreign country was in talks to loan Juba money with the goal of getting at least 1 month's worth of salaries paid. The bad news is that over the longer term, things could get truly dire. Speaking of France 24, head of economics at the University of Juba, Akor Marouk, said the situation will worsen in the next 2 or 3 months because the central bank might run short of foreign reserves and it will not be able to supply hard currency into the market. There's also worry that the South Sudanese pounds will continue to depreciate, plunging yet more people into poverty and encouraging even more lawlessness. To give just one example, much of the post-Civil War rural violence is driven by rival tribes stealing cattle and the revenge attacks that follow. Push even more of the population into poverty, and such lawlessness could spread. Yet the potential ways this oil disruption could affect South Sudan go beyond the merely economic and into the political. The first major effect is likely to be the cancellation of elections. Intended to be held in December this year, the elections have already been delayed due to failures to fully implement the peace agreement signed in 2018. The nation still doesn't have a permanent constitution, for example, which Vice President Riek Machar has used as an excuse to avoid going to the polls. The huge cut in oil revenues turbocharges the likelihood that the vote will be cancelled. Holding a nationwide election, especially in a nation riddled with violence, is an expensive endeavour. Anti-election elites now have the convenient excuse that the country is just too broke to afford it. The second major political effect could be opening up space for a new outside player in the country, the United Arab Emirates. Quite what price Abu Dhabi might extract is obviously unknown, but it is a potential outcome that could see Juba subordinated to the power plays various Gulf states are making in the region. More worrying still is what might happen if Juba can't secure a bailout, what lengths it might go to try and restore the ruptured pipeline. Here's Bloomberg. The revenue drought increases the likelihood that South Sudan will intervene militarily in Sudan's civil war in order to repair its broken infrastructure. To be clear, this would be a disaster. Sudan's civil war is already a chaotic mess in which various powers are jostling to support the winning side, and outside players, as expected, such as Russia and Ukraine, are known to have special forces on the ground, as we covered in a recent video. Throw into this South Sudanese invasion force, no matter how weak and under-equipped it may be, and there's no telling what might happen. For now, this possibility appears rather remote. Far more likely is Juba securing some kind of loan from an outside power that allows the corrupt, rickety system to keep on creaking at the expense of some national sovereignty. Still, the possibility of things truly going off the rails remains, either in the form of increased violence and anarchy in South Sudan, or in the form of an expanded Sudanese civil war. It may have been a single rupture in a single pipeline, but as this segment has hopefully shown, the Petrodar pipeline spill may yet have massive consequences that will reverberate out into the wider world.